Hi, Josh. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Will, thanks for having me.
Great to have you. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk with you about this new development in Colorado and what's happening. And uh, we we have a big moment in Colorado history coming up in three, uh, not even a month from now. It's coming in quick. S-
Yeah, no, that's right. It's November 8th will be, a huge day in Colorado and really around the country for psychedelic reform and access to psychedelic therapy. With the voting on Prop 122.
Yeah. So some people in the audience might remember a different name. Initiative 58 or Prop 58. Anyway, we're talking about the ballot measure that's now called Proposition 122 that's on the ballot in Colorado in November. That would, well, tell us about what it would do, Josh.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Formerly known as Initiative 58, officially called in the text of the measure the National Medicine Health Act of Colorado. I mean, this, and now on the ballot is Prop 122. And this is a measure myself, along with others, have been working on for quite some time. Helping to draft it with this goal, like how do we create access in Colorado for to psychedelic assisted therapy for any adult who needs it. And so that was sort of the impetus behind it. And big picture, of what it does, and then we can sort of dive into some of the details. But the way I like to look at it is there's two main things. It provides access by creating a regulated model to to psychedelic assisted therapy, or really just to psychedelic services in general. It can be therapeutic, or it can be self-growth or spiritual, through this regulated model that's will license healing centers and license facilitators. So there'll be a whole new sort of facilitator profession created in Colorado under DORA, of sort of this natural psychedelic medicine facilitator. So we never unpack that more, but I think that's one piece. There's this public facing, regulated, lots of guardrails model for supervised psychedelic use. There's no sales allowed. And then on the other side is that removes criminal penalties for the personal use of natural psychedelic medicines. Both allows an individual over the age of 21 to possess it, to grow it, to process it, and to share, like amongst their community in like a non-commercial sense. And this is sort of like really key for some of the communities, some of the indigenous communities that are out there, some of the ayahuasca circles that are out there, is to create a path that doesn't involve government regulation, but still in a limited sense protects what has been happening in Colorado for decades. So those are sort of like the two main pieces of Prop 122. And actually, there is a third piece I think is worth mentioning too. Is there's a lot of civil rights built in. So it also there's civil rights that protect an individual or a facilitator who's engaging in natural medicine services from it protects them around child rearing. It protects them like a child custody battle. It protects them from medical care. It protects them around someone can't, if someone's on probation and parole, they can't be forced back to jail because they're engaging in natural medicines. There's also some protections around like the police not using natural medicines as a basis to search the rest of your house. But the big piece I think on the civil rights side is like the medical care. And we saw it a lot with cannabis, where folks are being denied like organ transplants because they would admit to using cannabis. And so
Oh,
kind
wow.
of defeated the purpose a little bit, for not having these like civil protections in there.
Hmm. Wow. And also, in addition to those protections you mentioned, it looked like when I read the bill that there were also protections, not the bill, the proposition. It's not a bill yet, right? Until it, it gets voted on. Is that how it works? Is that the language?
Yes. It's a great point. So it's a statutory proposition right now.
Okay,
And
the proposition.
yeah, so if it passes with 50.1% of the vote, or 50% plus one, it'll become a statutory measure, which will leave it open to be changed by the legislature, which I think is a very key piece of this puzzle. And then a lot of the rules of how this works will be like made by DORA, the Department of Regulatory Agencies.
Right. So the stage we're at is proposition. It's going to general public voting on the ballot in November voting in Colorado. And going back to what you were saying about civil right protections, it looks like it also covers licensed individuals, for example, physicians, nurses, in the medical field even, someone who wants to get involved with natural medicines for their own use, that this would confer protections against, let's say, board complaints or some kind of tell us about that in terms of licenses.
Yeah, no, correct. There's also provision, that prohibits any adverse action related to any state-based license. This is key. State-based license in Colorado for an individual who engages in the personal use of natural medicines or or sort of provides natural medicine services under the regulated program. And so what this, as you mentioned, like not only does this protect, doctors and physicians at the state level, but also therapists, attorneys. I mean, really anyone who's licensed by by the state, that they're, the state can't use, the fact that you're engaging in, the personal use of natural medicines or provide natural medicine services as a reason to take away your license. Now, with that said, it doesn't mean, there's a fine balance. It also doesn't mean the door is wide open. There's still sort of professional standards. If someone's engaging in the natural or in the use of natural medicines in a way that's putting others in danger, like, yeah, there could still be, some, licensing actions. But, I think part of it here is like, is a broad-based protection. We'll have to figure out like what exactly that means, but it is a key piece for a lot of professionals. And this hopefully should allow, both psychotherapists, but physicians and physicians, to participate, both individually and professionally.
Right. Yeah. And so tell me a little about, I'm so curious, first of all, how you got interested in this work in the first place. It seems like this goes back a while for you in your career, in your law career. You've been working on decrim efforts and kind of advocacy around access to natural medicines and psychedelics generally for a while. Is that right? Tell us about it.
Yeah, no, for sure. So, it's like, well, it really just depends on how far back you want to go. But,
Okay.
I've had a personal relationship, with different natural psychedelics for quite some time. And it sort of like put me on sort of a path of like wanting to make the world a better place. And I sort of found my home in doing that in drug policy. And so for the last 18 to 20 years, I've been engaged in different forms of drug policy. Like, how do we end the war on drugs? How do we have a public health approach to substance use? And it's a lot of for a whole host of reasons, both on one hand, just the social justice, like needing to stop, this very like racist drug war. And on the other hand, just, freedom of, cognitive liberty, allowing people agency, over their own mind and their own consciousness to sort of like engage and grow in a manner that works for them. And so, for me, I started, really professionally in this space. We started a law firm, Vicente Sederberg, with this goal of how do we sort of leverage capitalism to end cannabis prohibition. And we drafted a lot of laws, not a lot, but we drafted Amendment 64 in Colorado, but we're also, part of, the measure to sort of decriminalize and permit medical cannabis, creating a licensed medical cannabis system in Colorado, and then eventually, around the country. And it's been really good. With that said, there's like, we've learned tons of things from the cannabis space, especially, hey, maybe capitalism isn't the right vehicle. Maybe we need to, sort of, understand some of the harms of capitalism a little bit more and put some more guardrails around that. Maybe, especially when it comes to like social equity and sort of, reciprocity, like, a lot of that wasn't sort of baked into the early cannabis days like we see it now. And so, one of the big lessons, I think a big thing with the National Medicine Health Act is that it does put sort of like equity and justice first from the get-go, which is a very key piece. Um, but so we worked on legalizing medical cannabis. We worked on legalizing adult use cannabis. We helped other states do it. We built a law firm around it. But really, it was, what really got me involved in sort of the plant medicine or psychedelic space, on this level was, was working with Kevin Matthews in the Decriminalize Denver campaign back in 2008 and 2009. And I remember, Kevin wanted to, decriminalize psilocybin, and I thought that was crazy. It's like this has never been done before, and so we, but he was passionate and organized, and him and his team, really, really wanted to move this forward. So we helped them draft this measure to decriminalize psilocybin in Denver, and and it passed. It actually passed the day after. No one thought they were going to pass, and it was like the day after the election. There's some last votes that came in, and that sort of started, my professional career, at least in the policy change around this space. And I also think, it's like that Denver vote then led to so many other cities passing, decrim measures, and and so it's really sort of like set off this like policy tidal wave, in many cases. And then, from there, you saw Oakland, move forward, and then Oregon as a state move forward. And now we're here in Colorado. I mean, the very, very progressive bill as well. One thing I will note, though, is I think there's like a misnomer around these city decriminalization measures. Is, a lot of folks are, they say, hey, mushrooms are decriminalized in Denver. Where do I buy them at? Or can I start my new like mushroom business in Denver? And the answer is no. It's like, the issue is that's not actually legal in Denver. It's still a crime at the state level. And so the Denver measure makes it the lowest law enforcement priority. It prohibits funding from the state of enforcing, or prohibits the city from enforcing state laws from a funding perspective, but it's truly not decriminalized. So I think it's like a little misnomer.
Right, deprioritized is probably a more accurate way to describe it. Yeah, that's important. And some of the folks listening are probably therapists, and some maybe even in our training for our psychedelic therapy training. And we get these questions a lot about, well, now that psilocybin's decriminalized in Denver, I can just do psilocybin therapy in Denver, right? It's like, no, you can't do that. Not yet.
Right.
It's confusing for folks, these different nuances and the language.
Yeah, and I think it's like, I guess on that point too, I think it's super interesting to mention federal law at this time. So our measure changes state law, but it doesn't change federal law. And so if our measure passes, yes, like the possession of psilocybin will be decriminalized in the whole state of Colorado, but it'll still be a federal crime. So if you're out at Rocky Mountain National Park and you're eating mushrooms after this passes, it's still it's your own federal land. You can still get a ticket.
Right.
And there's also sort of like implications around federal licensing and other issues as well.
Yeah, speaking of that, let's talk a little more about that and kind of like the state and the federal mismatch. And I guess maybe a place to start is, this might be a kind of an obvious question, but why try to change things at the state level when, in theory, psilocybin is going to go through phase 3 trials and eventually be looked at by FDA. There's no initiation of a phase 3 study that I know about yet, but there is hope that will happen. And the process that we use for other tools like I don't know, ketamine or other tools that have been through a phase 3 study get approved on the federal level. MDMA, of course, not a plant medicine, but on the way through phase 3, and hopefully, if it holds up, it won't be a political decision; it'll get approved. But why even go to a state level rather than, so to speak, waiting for psilocybin?
Great question. I think it's the strategy of going state by state really also kind of started in the cannabis world, and we saw no movement at the federal level, and so many people being arrested under state law that it made sense to us to say, like, hey, if we change state laws, then we can effectively remove 98% of all cannabis arrests.
Hmm.
And there wasn't, and there wasn't also the same, it's like, there wasn't the same push at the federal level. Now, people ask me sometimes about psychedelics and the legal status. It's super interesting because it's like, on one hand, it's like cannabis 1996. We have one state that has like a state-based program. On the other hand, it's a lot more legal than cannabis ever was. You have USONA, you have Compass, you have MAPS, you have all these companies, moving forward with, both psilocybin or MDMA, or ketamine is already approved, or all the different analogs, different varieties of these different compounds. And so that is the question: is why? And I think there's a couple of reasons. One is we don't know exactly if like psilocybin will ever be approved. I feel,
Right.
Knock on wood, I feel confident with MDMA, but our measure doesn't touch on MDMA.
Right.
Our state measure touch on psilocybin and psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, but not from peyote, and so we don't know if these substances will ever be approved. Just sort of like one reason, we don't know when.
Right.
And then the second reason is, and I think it's a really good question, is like, hey, should there be an avenue for the non-medicalized access to natural psychedelics,
Right.
outside of a prescription model? Is there, would people benefit from natural psychedelic therapy without like an underlying indication,
Right.
or or more in like a spiritual or religious sense or self-growth sense? And I think that is really the why of this measure, is that we allow another model. It's like, like, I do believe we'll have a very it's like we'll have this medical model that's approved by the FDA, and then sort of this middle ground model that's
Right.
lightly regulated by the state. And then our model also provides like the personal exploration through the decrim measure. And these other two pieces of like the personal use in this middle model wouldn't really exist if we just had the federal model.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, especially with psilocybin, to me, it makes so much sense to be, from a civic freedom perspective, and the right to work with a plant ally that can open up consciousness, can can, to quote Johns Hopkins, can occasion a mystical experience, right? That a substance that has been in use in ritual settings for thousands and thousands of years in indigenous frameworks, and also one that showed up in a really interesting study. You're probably familiar with David Nutt, the pharmacologist in the UK, was famously sacked from his government post when he wrote an opinion in a paper in London saying that riding horses is more dangerous than taking a psychedelic. Or I think he was talking specifically about MDMA, but he had this graph in this paper after he got fired that he published that showed, alcohol and heroin and, stimulants and all these things at the very high end of abuse and actual harm to society. And then psilocybin, like, all the way down at the far end of like this massive list of substances. And so I think when we start thinking about like risks and benefits, and obviously we're talking about adult use here, we're not talking about, kids getting into it. It's a whole nother thing, but obviously we need protections, access protections for children and so forth. Parents have to be responsible for what they have at home, right? But when you start looking at the big picture of benefits and drawbacks, and you look at prohibition and the drawbacks of that versus, the drawbacks of decriminalization, access, taking responsibility for ourselves and our families, and putting the onus of, so to speak, safety or protection more on the individual maybe, and less on law enforcement. To me, it's a no-brainer that the benefits outweigh the drawbacks.
Yeah, and I think that's I think that's a really good point. And part of it, I will admit, it's like we don't know exactly what open, it's like what a very accessible psilocybin experiences would look like, and how that affects the general public. But with that said, it's like what we know around psychedelics today, it's like as you mentioned, it's like it's really not that big of a deal. There's not that many arrests. It's like a lot of people use psychedelics in a very like responsible, safe setting. But some people won't. And I think that's like anticipate like, what does
Sure.
that look like? And
Right.
it's I think a big piece of this measure too is like with the state being in this like regulatory position, there'll be an opportunity to ask yourself, like, what sort of guardrails do we think make sense?
Right.
Like, should there be screenings around lithium or screenings around certain personality disorders? Should there be, like in Oregon, should be limited to one type of mushroom, or do we want this more open? In this conversation around like what sort of guardrails and what sort of like safety and training do we need to put in place is, there's a conversation that'll happen in this measure, sort of, over, the next 18 months, provided that it passes.
Yeah. Yeah. I think about some of the patients I treated earlier in my career who, maybe were younger, maybe in high school, maybe just like kids who were just a little different, maybe a little odd, and, maybe had a risk or a predisposition to psychosis. And, one of the fears, I think, and I've seen, like I said, I've seen it happen in a handful of my patients, is like these folks who might have a variety of different risks for psychosis, and then take a psychedelic, and the psychedelic experience kind of cracks open something underlying in that person, and then the question becomes, well, that person, would they have developed a psychotic disorder if they didn't ever take a psychedelic? And so what comes up for me is like this more paternalistic maybe concern as a physician, as a psychiatrist, of the diluting of the conversation about risk, and making sure, like you were just saying, that there are guardrails in place that would trigger someone who does have an underlying risk, who maybe has no business taking a psychedelic, to get that information, and have that readily available or part of the conversation somehow. So I guess, I mean, maybe it's just going back to what you said, is it's not without risk that something like this would get approved. But to me, on balance, the risk of harm to great multitudes of people is a lot less than what's already happening with people getting incarcerated for minor drug offenses.
Yeah, I agree with that. And well, let me ask you, I mean, do you think when it comes to looking at the risks and screening out, potentially individuals who this might be more destabilizing for, is that like a decision? Do you think like as a community or as the state, this is like, should be like a one size mandate that goes across the board? Like, should this be a rule from door? You need to screen out someone with, bipolar syndrome, or,
Right.
pick some disorder, or, do you think this is more like a case by case, therapist by therapist conversation that they need to have, with their own patients?
That's a great question. It brings up kind of a lot for me as a psychiatrist around decisions that I've made over the years to treat people in different ways. And I think for me, it's been really important to have the freedom to, for instance, taper people who have a psychotic disorder off of their antipsychotics, bearing in mind that there is a risk to doing that, and bringing other resources to bear for that person that could help them continue to flourish and thrive in their lives without having to bear the really terrible side effects that come from antipsychotic medications for certain people. So I think if I was laboring under a kind of a blanket prohibition of, if so-and-so ever had psychosis in the past, or if they have a parent with schizophrenia, or they have other risk factors for psychosis, you're never allowed to work with that person on psilocybin. I don't think that would feel good as a practitioner, because I know that their clinical judgment would sometimes dictate that the benefits outweigh the risk of harm in individual cases, and that people are more complex than just, oh, they're going to have a psychotic experience if they ever take psilocybin. It's kind of like what I was taught to teach, what I was taught to tell patients, which I learned pretty quickly not to do anymore, was, never go off your medication. You're fucked if you ever stop taking your antipsychotic or your antidepressant. And the reality just doesn't match up to that view that certain doors are always closed for certain people. It's all about what is the constellation of support, what's the constellation of challenge in that person's life. And I think just making very precise recommendations based on a deeper conversation about all the factors at play. Mm-hmm. So, and I would also say, when we start looking at like long-term health risks, and we have to talk about alcohol too, because I mean, we're having this conversation about psilocybin, but it's like, well, if somebody's drinking a lot, or they have reasons that I perceive that I want to, talk to them about what the downside, what I see as evidence of harm from their alcohol use patterns, because it's legal, it's like, it's up to them they're going to have to make that choice themselves. Right. I mean, there are extreme cases where someone gets their rights taken away because they've, hurt themselves or other people too much with alcohol, but those are extremely rare. So, I guess my political maybe position really is maybe more of a, if you're not hurting other people, and then we have to make our own choices about what we're exploring and what gives us meaning in our lives.
I think that's right. And, it's, at least in my circle and community, there's a lot of individuals I've known who've sort of been able to step away from alcohol, with different psychedelics, and sort of being able to break those patterns. And, and whether it's like, a macro dose, with a therapist, or, or if it's like microdosing over time, actually have, a lot of people I feel like are being able to use these substances to get off, like one of the only or one of the few legal substances that the world says is okay for us to drink. Yeah.
Right. And there are clinical trials with psilocybin specifically on alcohol use disorders. And and Bill W. from AA has famously been said to, have experienced, I think it was LSD in his case, in order to sort of have this awakening that caused him to stop. Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, and it's it's always, I think it's, we use alcohol as the marker of what is safe in society, and it's like, hey, almost anything should be legal.
Right.
Like, it's not a very, it's a pretty low bar if that's what
yeah. It brings questions up for me about, like, I can't remember which anthropologist it was who observed that, it's sort of like part of human nature, over the entire course of, however many hundreds of thousands of years of humanity to use substances to alter our consciousness. And having alcohol available and legal, I know a lot of people who, of course, get addicted to alcohol, but there are also people who are using alcohol to change their consciousness or their state temporarily. And it's almost like this, it's like taking Benadryl for sleep. Like there's a huge downside. It might get you to sleep, but you're going to feel crappy the next day.
Right.
It's like, versus like doing whatever you need to do to get to the bottom of the root causes of that insomnia. Right. Um, so yeah, I wonder if a lot of people, if there were more cleaner, maybe more, so to speak, healthier alternatives to alcohol for altering consciousness by ingesting something, if a lot of people would sort of jump the fence and move over to a different way.
Yeah, no, I wonder that too, and it's pretty difficult, because it's like I think a good substance that a lot of people would use instead of like kava, for example, but it's
Mm-hmm.
like kava, there's some liver toxicity there. Now, how does that compare to alcohol's liver toxicity? That's a whole other
Right.
question. But it hasn't been approved as a beverage by the FDA. So, it can only be really drank as a dietary supplement. So there's also kind of like a difficulty of like creating other sort of like alcohol substitutes that have effect on your sort of like consciousness that can be, they're like beverage form that people can drink in a social setting. And I don't know what it looks like, but I completely agree. Especially, I see like a lot of people using, kind of microdosing as that substitute a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, which is, under the Natural Medicine Health Act, there is no science, so, it's like on the personal use side, someone can, grow their own mushrooms and make their own microdoses and like share them with their community. But there's not gonna be any way to like buy or sell, really any of these psychedelic substances. In part because we're not looking to make the next cannabis industry. We're just, we're
Right.
looking to like provide access here for people to heal and to change their consciousness.
I think that's so important to underline what you just said, that this is not about commercialization. It's not about selling. In fact, selling would remain prohibited. So, I don't know what kind of ads are out there against Proposition 122, but I think it's really important for people to hear that again, that this is about opening up the possibilities for access for healing and personal use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is like a key piece, that there's no commercial sales. This is not the commercialization of it. And then I think another key piece too that we've built well, there's two pieces I want to talk about. One that we built into the regulated model is around access. So there's this big question about like how do we create equitable access to psychedelic therapies,
Right.
and sort of like the framework of the structure that we put in is that there's a lot of this will be fleshed out in rulemaking, but there's a mandate to have sort of like sliding scale licensing fees. So larger companies will pay higher fees than smaller companies. So there's sort of like access among there's like diversity amongst ownership, and size of these companies. And then this fund that's created can then be used to sort of provide access to low income individuals. And there's a
Mm.
mandate, there's a mandate from DORA to make rules around how do we make sure there's access for low income, those who've been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs, and people, and the indigenous and people who have like traditional
Mm.
use of these natural medicines. I think it's like a key piece of this puzzle because like, we're really in creating a regulated model, we're trying to make it in a way that's like, that's really rooted in equity and justice and sort of like
Mm.
honoring those who came before us and making this so it's like psychedelic therapy isn't just for rich white folks, that it's
Right.
actually accessible for everyone.
Right. And so that's a good piece to jump into this critique. There's a movement against this proposition that has said things like, this is really for venture capitalists, and for people to get rich on psychedelics in Colorado. But I don't see opportunity for that in this bill. For example, there's a limit, right, on the number of healing centers, for example, that one organization or a group of individuals could own, right? Tell me more about that. I mean, why are people saying this is about venture capital and people getting rich on psychedelics?
Yeah, I mean, I think, whenever there's like a new industry or new ecosystem created, people are sort of concerned for like who's to benefit, and when
Mm.
there's money behind a campaign, I think people are generally suspect of what's going on here. And
Sure.
the And this has been something, as like one of the drafters of the measure, I really dove into. We were debating for a long time of, should we create healing, should we mandate that healing centers only be nonprofit businesses? And we debated that internally. We talked to others in sort of this conscious capital community of like, how do we do this? And we decided, well, if we mandate everyone just to be nonprofit, then someone's gonna, you'll make a management company. There'll be there'll be like some system or structure to get around sort of like legislating corporate form. And we also looked at like, hey, maybe it's just like decrim only. Does that make sense? And for us, it was, well, when we decriminalize, cannabis, in 2006, 2007, thousands of businesses popped up with no rules. They said, oh, I can, there's enough protections for me, so I can like start a business. I don't know how long it's going to last. So I'm going to start a cannabis business based on like short term, let's get as much money as possible before they change the rules. And so we also didn't want this like short term extraction model in psychedelics either.
Right.
So we're kind of trying to figure out like, hey, what is the best way to go about this? And so what we did, is three main things. One that we talked about is there is no sales. So we're not talking about selling products. We're not like, we're not talking about, trying to, create, a whole new market and, how many sales can we sell every day, yada, yada, yada. Or how many, widgets can we sell every day? And, instead it's like based off of, therapy and facilitators, and two, the other two pieces, as you mentioned, it's like no individual can have an interest in more than 5 of these healing centers. And what does this mean? It's like, well, we've seen this mean before, is like this, depending on how the rules are drafted, like this could actually prohibit public companies from being involved, because you can't, because like an individual person wouldn't be able to like own a stock from 5 different companies. Or it prohibits, but it definitely prohibits like an individual from having any sort of financial interest in more than 5. So that sort of keeps us small. But the thing that I'm most excited about is, as we built in, this ESG screen into the licensing provisions. So any company that wants to participate in this spot has to go through a screen that, that'll be created by Dora that grades their environmental practices, their social responsibility practices, and their governance practices.
Wow.
And so and then they have to get a certain score to even qualify. And so what this could be is like, hey, are you net zero? You get 10 points. Oh, you're, you have a sustainability plan. Maybe you get 2 points. You pay your employees, living wage. You get 5 points. Oh, you pay your employees double living wage. You get 20 points. And oh, you have a reciprocity program. You get 15 points. Or just pick these numbers. But these sort of like saying, hey, how do these businesses plan to operate? And like we're going to score them based off of that, and only let businesses participate that have sound, environmentally friendly business practices.
Wow, that's exciting. I didn't realize that was built in there.
Yeah, and the strength of it will depend on the regulatory process, but the whole idea is like, it's like kind of like that double click. It's like, how do you figure out, hey, what do we hate about capitalism, which is generally like the race to the bottom, extraction, and like let's like try and get rid of those things.
Right, definitely. Well, I'm also curious, is a little bit of a talking about baking in, these controls in Colorado. Oregon, to shift gears for a moment, really took a very different approach from what I can tell. They said, look, we're going to put psilocybin services completely and totally outside of anything having to do with medical regulation, psychotherapy, psychiatry. We're calling it psilocybin services. We're going to license facilitators separately from their therapy licensure or their medical licensure. And it's just a really different approach. And I think it's interesting. So I'm curious, as you and the team kind of debated internally and developed the plan for Prop 122, what were you thinking about in terms of like, why go in this other direction with putting it under the Division of Regulatory Agencies and kind of bringing it, in my mind anyway, it looks like it's more integrated into psychotherapy as a regulated service in Colorado, and even psychiatry.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a fascinating debate, and it's and I think like how it plays out will be, we'll see, but it's like when we were sort of putting those things together, there was a lot of conversations with folks in the community about accessibility to
Yeah,
become, it's like, to become a facilitator, and some folks in the community wanted to make it really easy for folks to become a facilitator. While others said like, no, they're working with very powerful substances. Like we need a lot of training, and we need to make sure that that facilitators actually have real experience with these substances in a way that's like, that they
yeah,
know how to navigate some of the
yeah,
darkness. And
yeah,
and there's just a tension there, and the tension
sure,
is, it's a healthy tension, because like, you have safety on one hand and you have accessibility on the other. And I do believe it's like in the middle is like some place that, probably makes the most sense. How we sort of tackle the National Medicine Health Act was, hey, what if there's a way we can make tiered facilitator training? And
mm,
say like, hey, if you, so it's the language is that the training is ultimately going to be decided by DORA, but it's supposed to be tiered based off of the services being provided and sort of like the indications of the participants.
mm-hmm,
So the idea is that, maybe someone who's just being a trip sitter has a different level of training than someone engaged in like psychedelic assisted therapy.
yeah,
Someone coming for spiritual growth, it looks different than someone coming to heal trauma. And I think the difficulty, and you'd probably know this better, is I think, I don't necessarily know if everyone knows what they're going to work through in a psilocybin session before they get there, but
that's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah. You might think you're coming in for personal growth, and all of a sudden you're in a really gnarly trauma vortex that takes time to work through. But yeah, 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 I get it.
and, and,
That
and yeah, go on.
Well, on the surface, you might. I mean, I use myself as an example. Like I looked like a pretty highly functional person, until I started, plumbing the depths of my psychology, and come to find out there's all kinds of really intense stuff in there that, it's been amazing to get to access and work through, because it actually gives me more sovereignty and, flexibility and more joyful experience. Um, but but there were times where I really needed to be held by somebody much more experienced, let's say. Um, that's the trick, is like, for me, it's more about experience than it is about what the letters are after the person's name, because there are people who are incredibly gifted, who have every credential under the sun, and then there are people who are incredibly gifted who have no credentials formally at all. And then there are people who have every credential under the sun, and I would never want to sit with them as a facilitator for me, and just, completely misattuned and hopelessly kind of like uh, unemotional or something. And then, you have people who maybe go to Peru and drink ayahuasca and come back and open a shaman business after one, ayahuasca experience. So, and they're probably not in a great place to even understand what's going on when people have a complex reaction to something. So, to me, it's really not so much when I was trained by MAPS and MDMA therapy, I felt like a lot of what I needed to do was unlearn techniques that I'd learned in my training as a psychiatrist. But there was definitely a foundation there that was useful. There was definitely a foundation that was useful. So I think it's valid. What you're talking about. Not that you need, not Natural Medicine Health Act will be decided on, regardless of my opinion. But I think it does make sense to have a tiered approach where, uh, a person who has let's say, a spiritual emergency, or they have some kind of big experience with a not very deeply trained trip sitter, could always go and seek services from someone who has a deep understanding of trauma and trauma resolution. Um,
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think, there's it'll be really interesting of like, what sort of training requirements come about. I think a key piece of the Natural Medicine Health Act is there will be a large like public input process, public stakeholder process. Like, what do these trainings look like? If it's, there's a provision in ours where like, to be a facilitator, there's no prerequisite degree. But the state's allowed to give you credit for relevant experience, whether it's as a psychotherapist or as a psychiatrist or as as like a medicine keeper, and and how is that going to be measured? It's like a really good question, and I think it's, I always chuckle. It's like, hey, when people are, I love your thoughts on this, but when people are choosing like a facilitator, like what do they go to screen them to make sure that they're a good fit for them?
Yeah.
And I always, we laugh, like, is there a way we can mandate that the facilitators had to have like so many deep experiences with the medicine that they're working with prior to being a facilitator?
Yeah.
It's
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and then there's all this individual variation on what kind of facilitator works for you personally, versus the kind of facilitator I want to work with, and, for example, someone with more of a bent toward shamanism and who's going to use maybe Palo Santo or sage or something to clear the space in the room, might be a great thing for one individual, but then the next individual who really feels a lot safer and more held in a more kind of medical or clinical environment might really want to have a physician or a PhD or somebody who's more traditional or conservative in their approach.
I think that's absolutely right. I think it's it's like meeting different people where they are. It's like my mom would 100% want this to be covered by insurance, to be approved by the FDA. Whereas other folks will never want to step foot in any sort of clinical setting, and they're only want this in a very like natural, sort of like spiritually focused setting. And then there's the people in between. And I think in sort of my perfect worldview, provided this passes, I think we actually start to see these multiple different approaches that allow people to be met where they are. I think there's risk in each one though. It's like how do we deal with like the neo shamans that you mentioned that have very limited experience with some of these medicines, and then feel called to instantly start serving them, versus people who've been working with these medicines for decades and still don't feel like they're ready to start serving them.
Right. Yeah.
And it's I think one thing to note too that is very key on this topic is it's with the National Medicine Health Act. There's these two models. There's this regulated model, it's regulated by DORA, but then there is this decrim model, and in this very limited sense, it does permit indigenous communities and sort of existing communities to operate without being dictated how to operate by the state. And I think it's very key, because there's design, because DORA can't be telling an ayahuasca how to run their circle.
Right.
And so it's very designed to have these two different paths. With that said, though, it's the personal use path, we have to protect it. Can't, if people abuse it, then it's it could be on the chopping block with the state legislature. So it's very key, that it's this side is honored as well, but in a way that's true, and not people not abusing it. So
is there anything about the proposition that we haven't talked about that you want people to know about before we start wrapping up?
Talked about access. We talked about the personal use side. I mean, I think the one thing that Jen mentioned, and I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, is what natural psychedelic medicines are we talking about? And so it starts with, on the regulated side, with just psilocybin and psilocybin. And then there's an advisory board that's created, and to help address all these issues we just discussed over the last hour, but also that can recommend other natural psychedelic medicines to be added to the regulated program. And the menu that they can recommend includes DMT, includes ibogaine, and includes mescaline, but not from peyote. On the on the decrim side, it decriminalizes all of these, natural psychedelics, right away. So I think that's like something to note. And then I think another key piece, to note too, is that there's there is a lot, and this goes back to the civil rights, but there is a desire to try and like figure out what insurance coverage looks like here. And there's, the advisory board is supposed to create a report about it. There's a prohibition on sort of Colorado's Medicaid from denying coverage if coverage would otherwise be provided. So if Colorado Medicaid is providing coverage for this psychotherapy session, they can't deny it just because somewhere in your history of treating this person you use natural psychedelics. And that's like, you're coming back to like, how do we sort of like put this in like an access first model, and an equity first model. And then there's also, there's a couple other bells and whistles. One is there's a sort of easy record sealing provision. So folks with prior convictions can get their records sealed in a pretty expeditious manner. And there's probably a couple other pieces I'm forgetting, but we definitely didn't talk about those ones.
So that last piece sounds like it falls into the justice kind of conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. There's a lot to this proposition.
Yeah, and there is, and it's, it takes Oregon and it really like expands on it. It's like lessons learned from Oregon, plus, a lot of, a lot more equity, a lot more focus on sort of indigenous and historical cultures. And, and it moves this forward in a way, to me, that's very, very responsible, but very complex, but ultimately the success of this is going to come down to implementation. And it's,
right.
Have people who, if we can have the smartest people in the room, folks like yourself or others in the, the psychedelic therapy community, you're coming to the table and talking about like, hey, here's what rules make sense and here's what rules don't make sense based off of my experience.
Right.
And then we can have like a very effective program that can provide healing to a lot of people.
We sure need it.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Josh. This has been really illuminating. I've learned things about the proposition I didn't know about. And I hope that our listeners are, I'm sure they're getting a lot of value about hearing about the details. And as Josh mentioned, this is coming up on November 8th on the ballot in Colorado. So if people have questions or comments, reach out. I'll give the information about how to reach us in the intro and the outro of the podcast. And thanks for joining us, Josh.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. And hopefully all of your listeners are Colorado voters will vote yes to Prop 122 this November.
Yeah. Thanks for all your effort on this proposition and for taking a stand for accessibility and equity and moving things forward.
Yeah. It's I'm just kind of privileged to be able to fight this fight with with everyone. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Josh.
All right. Thank you.